For years, they thought they could get away with it, abusing power, bending the law, destroying lives. But tonight, they messed with the wrong man. Scene fades in, flashing police lights, a shadowy figure watching from a distance. They took everything from him. They killed what he loved. They thought he would break. A slow-motion shot, gunfire, a dog's final breath, a man standing still, his fists clenched. But some men don't break. Heartbeat sound, silence. Some men hunt, cut to black, a single breath. Then, explosive action. And now he's coming for them. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The evening had been peaceful. The sun dipped behind the rooftops, casting long shadows on the pavement. A cool breeze whispered through the trees, rustling the leaves like a quiet reminder that the world could be soft sometimes. Darius took a deep breath, savoring the crisp scent of freshly cut grass, the distant sound of a sprinkler ticking in someone's yard. His German shepherd, Titan, padded beside him, his leash hanging loosely in Darius's grip. This was their routine, a simple walk after a long day, a moment to disconnect, to breathe. But peace never lasted. The sound of tires rolling slowly over asphalt reached his ears before he saw the car. A black and white police cruiser turned onto the street, its headlights washing over him for just a second too long. Darius didn't change his pace, didn't look away, but he felt the weight of their gaze. It was the same every time. A flicker of recognition in their expressions, not because they knew him, but because they had already decided who he was. The car crept forward before coming to a stop a few feet ahead. The doors swung open. Two officers stepped out. Officer Calloway, the one in the driver's seat, leaned against the frame of his door, arms crossed, his eyes scanning Darius up and down. The other, Officer Mitchell, adjusted his belt, shifting his stance like he was already preparing for something. Darius kept his expression neutral, always polite, always controlled. "Evening," Calloway said, his tone too casual to be real. Darius gave a small nod. "Evening, officer." Mitchell took a slow step forward. "You live around here?" Darius met his gaze evenly. "Yes, sir. Just out for a walk." Calloway let out a short chuckle. "That right? 'Cause funny thing, we got a call about someone looking suspicious around this neighborhood." There it was, the excuse. Titan shifted slightly, his ears flicking toward the officers, sensing the shift in energy. Darius gave the leash the slightest tug, a silent command. "Stay calm." "Suspicious?" Darius asked, keeping his voice even. Calloway smirked. "You'd be surprised what people think is suspicious these days." Mitchell was still watching Titan, his eyes narrowing slightly. "That's a big dog," Darius exhaled slowly. "Yeah, he is." "He trained?" "Yes, sir." Mitchell tilted his head. "Trained for what?" Darius paused, feeling the trap closing around him. "Obedience. Protection." Mitchell exchanged a look with Calloway, a silent conversation passing between them. The kind of conversation men had when they knew they were in control, when they knew no one could stop them. Calloway took another step forward. "I'm going to need to see some ID. Not a request, a test." Darius knew his rights. He could ask why, he could refuse, but he also knew exactly what kind of men he was dealing with. He moved slowly, deliberately, reaching into his jacket. Titan let out a quiet growl, so low it was barely audible, but Calloway's hand twitched near his belt anyway. "Easy," Darius said, his voice calm but firm. He pulled out his wallet and held it up, making sure they could see every movement. Mitchell's lips curled slightly, something almost smug in his expression. "Yeah, I think we're going to need you to step over here for a second. Just a few questions." Darius exhaled. This was how it always started. Darius stepped forward, keeping his movements slow, controlled. Titan stayed at his side, muscles tense but obedient. The officers watched him closely, eyes scanning for the slightest misstep, the smallest excuse. He had seen this before, too many times to count. The bait was being laid and they were waiting for him to bite. Mitchell took the wallet from Darius's outstretched hand, flipping it open with lazy arrogance, as if expecting to find something incriminating inside. His fingers traced over the identification card, his lips twisting slightly before he turned it toward Calloway. "Well, look at that," Mitchell mused, shaking his head. "We got ourselves a real-life soldier." Calloway took the wallet from him, glancing at it with a smirk that barely masked his disdain. "Delta Force, huh?" His voice carried an edge, the same kind of condescending tone Darius had heard before. "That's supposed to mean something?" Darius didn't react. He had learned long ago that men like this craved a reaction, fed off it. Any sign of irritation, any flash of defiance, would give them the excuse they were looking for. So he remained exactly as he was, calm, polite, immovable. "It means I served," Darius said, his tone measured, "and now I work in security consulting, as I mentioned earlier." Calloway let out a slow, exaggerated chuckle, shaking his head. He handed the wallet back in a way that forced Darius to step forward to take it. A small thing, a power move. "That's so," Calloway said, shifting his weight, "because what I see is a guy walking around a neighborhood where people don't seem to recognize him." He tilted his head slightly, his smirk widening. "And you know how it is. Folks around here get nervous when they see someone they don't think belongs." Darius's jaw tightened just slightly, but his voice stayed even. "I do belong. I live here." Calloway folded his arms, stepping a little closer. "Then you won't mind answering a few more questions, will you?" Darius remained where he was, neither backing away nor stepping forward. "I believe I already have," Mitchell scoffed under his breath, adjusting his belt like he was itching for something more. "I don't know, Calloway. Something about his attitude don't sit right with me." He took another step forward, intentionally closing the space between them. "Guy seems a little tense, don't you think?" Calloway smirked. "Yeah, almost like he's got something to hide." Titan let out another low growl, his body shifting just slightly. Mitchell's eyes flicked toward the dog. "You got that thing under control?" Darius tightened his grip on the leash. "He's fine. He's trained." Mitchell narrowed his eyes. "Yeah. Trained for what?" Darius exhaled, resisting the urge to roll his shoulders, to shake off the weight pressing down on him. "Protection? Security? He follows commands." Calloway let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "A dog like that, all trained up to attack. Dangerous thing to be walking around with, don't you think?" "He's not trained to attack," Darius corrected, patience thinning despite himself. "He's trained to defend." Calloway's smirk widened. "And what exactly does he think you need defending from, huh?" The words sat heavy between them, charged with something unspoken, something calculated. Darius didn't answer. Mitchell exhaled sharply, shaking his head like he had already made up his mind. "I don't know, Calloway. Guy's got a big dog. Won't answer questions. Seems real on edge." He took another step forward, now close enough that Darius could smell the faint trace of coffee on his breath. "I think maybe we need to go ahead and bring him in, just to be safe." Darius could feel Titan's tension rising, the leash pulling just slightly as the German Shepherd adjusted his stance. He could sense the shift, the moment just before things spiraled out of control. "You don't need to do that," Darius said carefully, keeping his voice controlled. "I've cooperated. I've shown my ID. There's no cause to detain me." Mitchell gave an exaggerated shrug. "Maybe, but see, I just don't like the way this is going." Calloway tilted his head. "I think we're going to need you to turn around. Put your hands behind your back. Just for our safety, you understand." Darius's fingers twitched slightly, but his voice remained calm. "I haven't done anything." Calloway's smirk deepened. "Yeah? Then you won't mind." It was a test, a deliberate, calculated provocation. And then Mitchell reached out, a hand on Darius's wrist, firm, insistent. Titan's snarl cut through the air like a blade. Instantly, both officers' hands went to their weapons. The air shifted. It was a subtle thing, barely noticeable to anyone who didn't understand the weight of moments like these. But Darius understood. His breath slowed, his heartbeat steady, his muscles coiled not in panic but in calculation. Titan's snarl deepened, his body tense, his instincts screaming that his handler was in danger. "Get that damn dog back," Mitchell barked, stepping back slightly, his hand hovering over his holster. Darius didn't move, didn't flinch, his grip on the leash firm but controlled. "Stand down," he commanded, his voice sharp, precise. Titan obeyed instantly, his body lowering just slightly, but his dark eyes never wavered from the officers. He was still locked in, still watching, waiting. Calloway let out a small chuckle, shaking his head like he wasn't impressed. "Yeah, I don't like this," he muttered. His fingers twitched near his gun. "You're getting real close to resisting, my guy." Darius exhaled through his nose, forcing the heat rising in his chest to cool. "I am standing still. My dog is under control. You're the only ones escalating this." Mitchell scoffed. "Yeah? That mutt of yours sure don't seem under control to me." His voice dripped with mockery, but there was something else there. Something deeper. Agitation. Maybe even a little fear. Darius clenched his jaw. "He's reacting to you," he said evenly, "because you're treating this like a threat when it isn't." Calloway's smirk faltered, just for a second. He had expected Darius to push back, to give them a reason, but Darius had seen too many fights. Too many men like this who used authority as a weapon. He wasn't going to give them the excuse they wanted. Calloway tilted his head. "You like to argue, don't you?" Darius met his gaze without hesitation. "I like to be treated like I belong in my own neighborhood." Mitchell exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head. "I don't know, Calloway. Guy's got a problem with authority." Darius almost laughed at the irony. Authority? These men weren't authority. They were opportunists, looking for an excuse to put another mark on their record. Calloway's fingers tapped against his belt, his mind already made up. "Yeah," he said, his voice carrying that same false ease, the same casual cruelty. "I think we're done here." Then he reached forward. Darius saw it before it happened. The shift in Calloway's stance, the way his muscles tensed just slightly before the grab. He moved on instinct, stepping back just enough to keep his balance, his free hand coming up to block. Mitchell moved faster. His grip was like iron as he grabbed Darius's forearm, yanking him forward. Titan lunged. It happened in a split second. The German shepherd surged, his body reacting not out of aggression, but protection. His powerful frame tensed, his snarl turning into something deeper, more primal. Mitchell shouted, stumbling back, his hand jerking toward his gun. "No!" Darius barked, his voice sharp, commanding. He pulled the leash tight, forcing Titan back before he could reach the officer. The damage was already done. The sound of a gun clearing its holster sliced through the night. Darius's stomach clenched as Calloway stepped back, his gun drawn, aimed straight at Titan. "Back! Get that damn dog back now!" Darius barely heard the words, his entire body locked in place, his breath caught in his throat. Every inch of him screamed to move, to protect, to stop what was about to happen. Titan had stopped moving. His stance was rigid, his ears pinned back, but he hadn't lunged again. He had followed orders. But Calloway didn't care. Darius could see it in his eyes, the shift from control to something more dangerous. The thrill, the satisfaction of finally having a reason. Mitchell was already cursing under his breath, but his own hand was near his holster too, feeding off the tension, ready to fire. Darius raised both hands, his heart slamming against his ribs. "He's under control. You don't have to." The gunshot rang out, tearing through the silence like a blade. Titan let out a sharp, strangled yelp. Then he crumpled. Time fractured. The sound of the gunshot lingered in Darius's ears, stretching the moment into something unreal, something distant. The world around him blurred, the street lights above casting long, flickering shadows against the pavement. Titan staggered, his powerful body folding beneath him, his legs trembling as if his instincts still fought against the collapse. Then he hit the ground. Darius's breath caught in his throat, a sharp, burning sensation rising in his chest. He moved before he could think, dropping to his knees beside his dog, his hands reaching out in desperation. The warmth of Titan's fur, once steady and solid, now felt fragile beneath his fingers. His breathing was labored, uneven. Blood seeped onto the pavement, dark and spreading, pooling beneath his trembling body. "No, no, no, stay with me," Darius whispered, pressing his hands against the wound, his fingers slick with warmth. Titan let out a soft, broken whimper, his eyes locking onto Darius's face, searching for reassurance, searching for a command. but there was nothing left to give. A bitter, raw scream burned at the back of Darius's throat, but it never made it past his lips. Instead, his breath came out ragged, shallow, his body trembling as he tried to hold on to the dog that had never once failed him. His protector, his shadow, his family. Behind him, boots crunched against the pavement. "You should have controlled him," Calloway muttered, holstering his weapon, like it was just another routine action, like he had just disposed of an inconvenience instead of taking a life. Damn liability. Darius's head snapped up, something darker, something colder flashing through his vision. His chest rose and fell with deep, uneven breaths, his jaw clenched so tightly that his teeth ached. Mitchell exhaled sharply, still standing a few feet away, his fingers twitching near his holster. "Should have just cooperated, man." Darius's muscles locked. The words sounded distant, like they were coming from behind a thick layer of glass. Cooperated? He had. He had followed every damn rule. He had answered their questions. He had shown them his ID. He had done everything he was supposed to do. And still, they had taken something from him. Titan let out one last, shallow breath. And then, he was gone. Darius's entire body went still. Something inside him, something he had spent years bearing beneath control, beneath discipline, snapped. The grief burned, twisting into something hotter, something sharper. His fingers curled into fists, his breathing slow, measured. The weight of Titan's body against his knees felt heavier now, an anchor dragging him down, drowning him in a rage so deep it left no room for anything else. Mitchell took a step back, sensing the shift. "We should wrap this up." Calloway didn't move. His smirk was still there, barely, but there was something else in his eyes now, a flicker of hesitation. Darius rose slowly, his movements deliberate. His hands, still slick with blood, hung at his sides, fingers twitching, his stance shifting. The air around him felt charged, humming with something unspoken, something dangerous. Calloway stiffened, adjusting his grip on his belt. "Now don't do anything stupid." Darius tilted his head slightly. "Stupid?" he echoed, his voice low, calm in a way that should have been unsettling. Mitchell shifted uneasily. "Let's just bring him in, man. We don't need another mess." Calloway exhaled, his smirk returning, though weaker this time. "Yeah," he muttered, stepping forward. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." Darius didn't move. Calloway's smirk faded. "Now!" Still, Darius didn't move. Mitchell tensed, his hand now fully gripping his holster. "I said—" Darius stepped forward. It was only an inch, a shift so small it could barely be called movement. But it was enough. Calloway reached for his cuffs. Darius moved. Fast. The next breath was chaos. Darius didn't think. He didn't need to. His body reacted the way it had been trained to. Years of instinct, precision, and discipline igniting in an instant. Calloway reached for his cuffs. Darius stepped in. His hand shot forward, gripping the officer's wrist before he could react. A sharp twist, a shift of weight. Calloway's balance was gone. The officer barely had time to let out a grunt before his body slammed against the pavement, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. Mitchell's hand flew toward his gun. Darius was faster. A sharp, controlled strike to the wrist sent the holster snapping shut before the weapon could clear it. Another move, a swift step inside Mitchell's reach, and Darius drove an elbow into his ribs. The officer stumbled back with a strangled gasp, his knees nearly buckling from the sudden force. The night air pulsed with tension, thick and electric. The entire encounter had lasted less than 3 seconds. Mitchell clutched his side, his face twisted in shock, confusion, and something else. Fear. Calloway groaned from the ground, rolling onto his side, his hand reaching for his radio. Darius stepped on it. The radio crackled weakly beneath his boot, the muffled static swallowed by the quiet fury burning in his chest. Mitchell was still frozen, his breath coming in uneven bursts, like his body couldn't decide between fight or flight. Darius met his gaze, his voice steady, low. "Pick one." Mitchell swallowed hard, his fingers twitching. "You just assaulted an officer," he said, though the words lacked the confidence they should have carried. Darius's jaw tightened. "No," he said, his voice controlled, his stance unwavering. You assaulted me. Calloway shifted slightly under his boot, letting out a strained chuckle. You're done, he muttered, his breath ragged. We'll bury you for this. Darius looked down at him. I'm already buried. He stepped back, letting Calloway scramble up onto his elbows, his face twisted in anger, in humiliation. But there was something else there too, uncertainty. Darius turned his gaze toward Mitchell. Take your partner, he said, voice flat, devoid of emotion, and walk away. Mitchell hesitated. His breathing was still unsteady, his hands clenched at his sides, but his eyes flickered toward Calloway, then back to Darius. For a second, just a second, Darius saw the calculation in his expression. Then, without another word, Mitchell grabbed Calloway by the arm and pulled him to his feet. The two officers stepped back, their movements stiff, their expressions unreadable. Darius didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, Titan's blood still on his hands, his chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. Calloway shook off Mitchell's grip, glaring at Darius with something venomous. This isn't over, he spat. Darius held his gaze, his voice quiet, certain. No, he said, it isn't. The officers turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Darius stood there for a long time, the distant hum of the city pressing in around him, the weight of everything sinking deep into his bones. Then slowly, he looked down at the ground, at the empty space where Titan had been. His fingers curled into fists. Something inside him, something dark, something patient, settled into place. This wasn't justice. Justice had never been meant for men like him. But revenge? Revenge was something else entirely. The house was silent, not the peaceful kind of silence, but the heavy, suffocating kind. The kind that settled in after something was ripped away, leaving behind an absence that could never be filled. Darius sat at his kitchen table, staring at his hands. Titan's blood had dried beneath his fingernails, staining the creases of his palms. He should have washed it off by now, should have tried to scrub away the reminder, but he hadn't. Across the table, his sister Alana sat with her arms crossed, watching him carefully. She had arrived the moment she heard, storming through his front door, demanding answers, but now she was quiet. You haven't said a word since I got here, she finally said, her voice softer than before. Not a single damn word. Darius exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping once against the wooden surface. What do you want me to say? Alana's jaw clenched. That you're okay. That you're not about to do something stupid. Darius lifted his gaze, meeting hers. I'm not okay. She swallowed, looking away for a moment before inhaling sharply. Darius, listen to me. We have to take this the right way. There's a case to build here. You were harassed, you were assaulted, and they killed Titan. There are laws. There are no laws for men like me. Darius cut in, his voice cold even. You know that. Alana's hands curled into fists on the table. Then what? You want to throw your life away? Darius's lips twitched, but it wasn't a smile. They already threw it away for me. She shook her head, anger flashing across her features. You think you're the first? You think you're the only one who's been through this? You know how many families have lost brothers, fathers, sons? You think we don't all want to burn the whole damn system down? Darius didn't answer. Alana leaned forward, her voice dropping to something just above a whisper. I know what's going through your head. I see it. But I'm telling you right now, if you go down that path, she exhaled sharply, shaking her head. There's no coming back. Darius tilted his head slightly, studying her. What makes you think I want to come back? Alana's face twisted with something between grief and frustration. Because you're not them, she whispered. Darius leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting toward the window. The street outside was quiet now. The neighborhood returned to its carefully constructed illusion of peace. But peace wasn't real. Not here. Not anymore. He turned back to Alana, his expression unreadable. Let it go, Alana. Her breath hitched. She stared at him for a long moment, waiting for something, anything to crack in his expression. But nothing did. Finally, she exhaled, rubbing a hand over her face before standing. I can't watch you do this, she said quietly. Darius didn't respond. She hesitated for a second longer, like she wanted to say something else, like she wanted to pull him back from whatever edge he was standing on. But in the end, she didn't. She just turned and walked out the door. The moment she was gone, the house felt even emptier. Darius sat there for a while, unmoving. Then slowly, he reached out, his fingers brushing over the object sitting on the counter. Titan's leash. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. The worn leather felt familiar, solid, a reminder of what had been taken, a reminder of why this couldn't be left to courts or lawyers or empty promises of justice that would never come. He tightened his grip around it. Then with a quiet breath, he stood. There was work to do. The night air was thick with humidity, pressing down like an invisible weight. Darius moved through the darkness with ease, his footsteps silent against the pavement. The city stretched out before him, bathed in the dim glow of streetlights, humming with the distant sounds of life. But none of it touched him. Not tonight. His mind was sharp, his body controlled. Every movement was measured, every breath steady. He had spent years in war zones where hesitation meant death, where emotions were a luxury he couldn't afford. And now as he walked through the quiet streets, he felt it again. That same clarity, that same purpose. He wasn't going to the police station. He wasn't going to file a complaint. He was going hunting. The first step in any operation was intel. Know your target, understand their routine, their weaknesses. He had already spent years watching men like Calloway and Mitchell operate, but tonight he needed specifics. His first stop was the Hollow, a dive bar on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't the kind of place that welcomed newcomers, but that was exactly why he was here. Darius stepped inside, the scent of cheap beer and stale cigarettes washing over him. The place was dimly lit, filled with men who didn't want to be seen, and conversations that weren't meant to be overheard. A few heads turned as he entered, but most people minded their own business. That was the kind of place this was. No one asked questions and no one answered them. He spotted a familiar face near the back. Eddie Greer, a low-level informant, the kind of guy who always had an ear to the ground. He wasn't a criminal, but he wasn't clean either. He survived by knowing things other people wanted to keep quiet. Darius walked over, sliding into the empty seat across from him. Eddie glanced up, his expression shifting from mild surprise to cautious curiosity. "Well, damn," Eddie muttered, leaning back in his chair. "Didn't expect to see you here, man." Darius didn't waste time. "I need to know where Calloway and Mitchell drink." Eddie exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "See? Now that's an interesting question. And usually I charge for interesting questions." Darius reached into his jacket, pulled out a $100 bill, and slid it across the table. Eddie snatched it up without hesitation, tucking it into his pocket. "They got a regular spot, O'Malley's, cops and off-duty security types. They like it because nobody asks questions. Calloway's been getting real comfortable there lately." Darius nodded. "What time?" Eddie smirked. "Late. Around 11, midnight. Stays it till he's drunk enough to think he owns the world." Darius leaned forward slightly. "And Mitchell?" Eddie shrugged. "Mitchell's more paranoid. He's been keeping his head low since that shooting. But Calloway?" He let out a low chuckle. "Calloway's a cocky son of a bitch. He thinks he's untouchable." Darius let the words settle between them. Untouchable. Not anymore. He stood up, nodding once to Eddie. "Appreciate it." Eddie raised an eyebrow. "I get the feeling you ain't planning to just have a drink with them." Darius didn't answer. Eddie let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "Just be careful, man. Cops like them, they don't go down easy." Darius gave him one last look before turning and walking out of the bar. The streets felt colder now. He had what he needed. Now it was just a matter of execution. O'Malley's was exactly the kind of place Eddie described. A rundown bar with a neon sign that flickered every few seconds, barely hanging on to its last breath of life. The parking lot was half full, the kind of cars that belonged to men who wanted to be left alone. Darius parked a few blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, blending into the darkness. He didn't need to step inside to know Calloway was here. He could hear his voice the moment he got close. Drunk. Loud. Laughing too hard at a joke no one else found funny. Darius moved to the side of the building, slipping into the alley that ran along the back. A single light flickered above the rear exit, casting weak shadows against the brick walls. This was where Calloway would stumble out when he had too much to drink, where he would fumble with his keys, his mind fogged with alcohol and arrogance. Darius waited. Minutes passed. Then the door swung open. Calloway stepped out, chuckling to himself, his steps uneven as he made his way toward his car. His jacket was unbuttoned, his holster barely secured at his hip. He was vulnerable. Darius moved. A sharp step forward. A quick grab. Calloway barely had time to register what was happening before Darius slammed him against the brick wall, his forearm pressing hard against his throat. The laughter died in an instant. Calloway choked, his hands grabbing at Darius's arm, his breath coming in sharp, panicked bursts. "What?" he gasped. "What the—" Darius leaned in, his voice quiet, deadly. "You remember me?" Calloway's eyes widened, his mind catching up to reality. Darius pressed harder, his voice still eerily calm. "You think I forgot?" Calloway clawed at his grip, his body twisting as he tried to break free, but Darius didn't budge. "You killed him!" The words were cold, matter of fact. Calloway let out a strained laugh, though there was no amusement in it. "What, that damn dog?" He coughed. "It was just a—" Darius drove his fist into Calloway's stomach. Hard. The officer let out a pained grunt, his body jerking forward from the impact. He coughed, gasping for air, his face contorting in shock. Darius grabbed him by the collar, yanking him up, making sure their eyes met. "This is the last time you walk away from something like this." Calloway's breath was ragged, his hands trembling. Darius let the silence stretch, let the fear settle into the officer's bones. Then he released him. Calloway stumbled, catching himself against the wall, his body shaking. Darius stepped back, his expression unreadable. "You're going to feel what it's like to be hunted," he said quietly. Calloway's hands curled into fists, but there was no fight left in him. Darius turned, walking away into the night, leaving the officer slumped against the wall, gasping for breath. This was just the beginning. The night was thick with silence, but not the peaceful kind. It was the kind of silence that settled after something violent had just happened. The kind that weighed heavy, pressing down like an unseen force. Darius walked away from the alley, his heartbeat steady, his breath controlled. Calloway was still slumped against the wall, gasping for air, shaken in a way he had never been before. The arrogance was gone, stripped away the moment he realized he wasn't the one in control anymore. But this wasn't over. Darius wasn't interested in just one moment of fear. He wanted Calloway to live in it, to feel it every second of every day, to wake up knowing that something was coming for him. And then, when the moment was right, he'd take everything. The next day, the world carried on like nothing had changed. People went to work. Cars filled the streets. The sun rose, casting its usual golden glow over the city. But for Calloway, things weren't normal anymore. Darius watched from a distance as the officer pulled into the precinct, his shoulders stiff, his eyes darting from side to side. He was looking over his shoulder now. That was the first crack. Darius smirked. Cracks always spread. Calloway parked in his usual spot, stepping out of his car with an air of forced confidence. But Darius saw the tension in his stance, the way his fingers twitched near his belt, the way he scanned the parking lot before heading inside. He was already unraveling. Darius exhaled slowly, his hands resting on the steering wheel as he watched. He had no intention of stopping here. This was a war, and Calloway didn't even know the rules. Mitchell was next. Unlike Calloway, Mitchell was more cautious. He had always been the one who watched his partner's back, the one who hesitated before making a move. He had been the first to pull his weapon that night, but he had also been the first to flinch. Fear had always been there, buried beneath the surface. Darius just needed to bring it to the light. Mitchell lived alone, a small apartment tucked into a quiet part of the city. No family, no one to check in on him. That made things easier. Darius spent the next night watching from a rooftop across the street, waiting. The hours stretched on, but he was patient. At exactly 2:17 a.m., Mitchell's light flicked off. Darius moved. He didn't break in. He didn't need to. Fear wasn't about direct confrontation. It was about the unknown. A single cut to the power line outside. The entire building went dark. A few lights flickered on in nearby apartments, confused neighbors peering out their windows. But Darius was only watching one, Mitchell's. A moment later, the curtain shifted. Darius could almost hear the officer's pulse spike from here. Seconds passed, then minutes. Mitchell didn't step outside. He wasn't reckless. He stayed inside, waiting, unsure. But that was the point. Darius pulled out his phone and sent a single text. "You don't feel safe, do you?" A minute passed, then another. Then 3 dots appeared on the screen. Mitchell was typing. They disappeared. Clever. He didn't want to engage, but the damage was done. Darius tucked the phone away, slipping back into the shadows. Mitchell wasn't going to sleep tonight. And the next time he closed his eyes, he'd wonder if someone was waiting in the dark. The precinct was buzzing with tension by morning. Darius sat across the street at a coffee shop, sipping black coffee, listening to the conversations around him. "They say Calloway looked like a wreck this morning," one officer muttered to his partner, like he hadn't slept at all. The other officer snorted. Mitchell, too, jumped at his own reflection in the break room. "What the hell's wrong with them?" Darius smirked. Paranoia was a powerful thing. It made men sloppy. It made them second-guess themselves. And soon it would make them desperate. He checked his phone, scrolling through the local news. Nothing yet. But it was coming. He had already sent the first batch of emails to the right people. Reporters, internal affairs officers who had been waiting for something to latch on to. Advocacy groups who had spent years collecting stories about police abuse, but never had solid proof. Now they did. Darius had made sure of that. The footage of Calloway and Mitchell breaking into his home. The body cam malfunctions. The falsified reports. It was all lined up, ready to burn through the city like wildfire. He wasn't just taking them down physically. He was dismantling everything they had built, piece by piece. That evening, Darius returned home, his body tired but his mind sharp. He walked into his kitchen, exhaling slowly. Then he stopped. Something was off. The air felt wrong. His hand instinctively went to his waistband, where a knife was concealed beneath his hoodie. He moved carefully, his footsteps silent against the hardwood floor. Then he saw it, a single envelope on his kitchen table. He hadn't left it there. Darius narrowed his eyes, his heartbeat slow, steady. He reached for it carefully, flipping it over. No return address, just his name written in sharp, deliberate handwriting. He opened it. Inside was a single photograph of himself, walking out of O'Malley's the night he confronted Calloway. Darius's jaw tightened. A small, neatly typed note was attached. "We see you." His fingers curled around the edges of the photo. The game had changed. Someone was watching him now. Darius exhaled slowly, his grip tightening. He wasn't the only predator in this fight, but that just made it more interesting. Darius stood in his dimly lit kitchen, the photograph still in his grip. His breathing remained slow, measured, but inside something sharpened. Someone had been close enough to take this picture, close enough to leave it in his house without him knowing. His eyes flicked to the window. The blinds were down, the locks were in place. No forced entry, which meant they had a key. His mind worked quickly, running through the possibilities. The landlord? Unlikely. Darius had changed the locks himself. Someone in law enforcement? More probable. Calloway and Mitchell had access to department-issued lockpicks, but they wouldn't be this subtle. This was different. A message. "We see you." Darius turned the photograph over, checking for anything else. Nothing. No hidden markings, no fingerprints. Clean. Whoever had left this knew what they were doing. A slow exhale left his lips. Good. Let them think they had the upper hand. He set the photo down, his fingers pressing into the edges of the paper for just a moment longer before he released it. Then he moved. His first priority. Security. He checked every entry point in the house. Windows locked. Front and back doors reinforced. He moved with purpose, his mind already shifting gears. This wasn't fear. Fear made men reckless. Fear made them hesitate. Darius didn't hesitate. This was war. And now he wasn't just hunting, he was being hunted. The city looked different when you knew someone was watching you. The next morning, Darius left his house the same way he always did. His routine didn't change. If someone was tracking him, they wouldn't notice a difference. He moved with the same casual ease, the same purposeful steps. But now he was watching too. It didn't take long to spot them. Across the street, a car that had never been there before. A white sedan, tinted windows, parked in the same spot for over an hour. No movement. No one stepping out, just sitting there. A second tail, less obvious. A man sitting at a bus stop pretending to check his phone. He wasn't waiting for a bus. The way he shifted every time Darius moved was enough of a tell. Sloppy, amateurs. Darius let them watch him. He didn't change direction, didn't call attention to them. If they thought they were in control, they'd get comfortable. And comfortable men made mistakes. He went to work like nothing was wrong. The office was quiet as usual. A private security firm, mostly desk work, logistics. The kind of job that gave him access to systems most people didn't even know existed. He sat at his desk, fingers moving across the keyboard as he pulled up surveillance records from the city's traffic cameras. If someone had been following him, they had left a digital footprint. He started with the white sedan. 2 days ago, the car wasn't there, but yesterday it appeared. Twice, once near his house, once outside the gym he trained at. Darius narrowed his eyes. He switched to a different screen, running the plate number through a backdoor database. It wasn't registered to the police department. No rental records. Private. Someone had gone out of their way to make sure it wasn't traceable. Interesting. Darius leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose. Whoever they weren't cops, which meant this was bigger than Calloway and Mitchell. He didn't like unknown variables. The next move wasn't his. That night he was waiting. He left the lights in his house off, his silhouette barely visible through the blinds. He made sure the car across the street could see him, that they thought he was settling in for the night. Then he disappeared. Darius slipped out the back, moving through the alley like a shadow. He had mapped this area out long before he had ever needed to. He knew every escape route, every blind spot. He came up behind the white sedan, moving low, unseen. The driver was inside, barely illuminated by the dim glow of his phone screen. Darius moved fast. He yanked the car door open, one hand gripping the man's shirt, the other pressing the cold edge of a blade just under his chin. The man jolted, his breath hitching, his phone slipping from his fingers. "Drive," Darius ordered, his voice calm. The man hesitated. "Where are we going?" the man rasped, his hands gripping the wheel too tightly. Darius studied him through the reflection of the windshield. "You're going to tell me exactly who sent you," he said quietly. The man swallowed hard. Darius didn't give him the chance to think. He grabbed the back of his neck, his grip tight. "I'm not going to ask twice." The man's breath was shaky now. He wasn't trained for this. Just a follower, a disposable piece on someone else's chessboard. "I don't know his name," the man stammered. "Wrong answer." Darius tightened his grip. "Try again." The man swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. "I swear, I don't know. I just got told to sit here, watch your place, report if you leave." Darius narrowed his eyes. "Report to who?" The man hesitated, his hands clenching the steering wheel. Darius sighed. "You're wasting my time." "I don't know." The man's voice was more desperate now. He calls himself Bishop." Darius's gaze sharpened. Bishop. It wasn't a name he had heard before. Not in this city. He filed it away, letting the silence stretch, watching the man squirm. Then he leaned in slightly. "If you're lying to me," he murmured, "I'll know." The man nodded quickly, his breath shallow. Darius exhaled slowly, then pulled back, letting go of his grip. "Get out of the car." The man hesitated, his whole body tense. "What?" Darius gestured with the knife. "Out." The man scrambled, fumbling with the door handle before stumbling onto the pavement. Darius took the driver's seat. The door slammed shut. And then he drove away, leaving the man standing in the dark, shaking. Now he had a name. Bishop. Someone was watching him. Someone who wasn't Calloway. And Darius was going to find out why, one way or another. Darius drove without a destination, his hands firm on the wheel, his mind sharper than ever. The city stretched out before him, bathed in the glow of streetlights. But he wasn't focused on the roads. His thoughts were locked onto one thing. Bishop. The name meant nothing to him. No old enemies. No past operations, no connections. That made it worse. An unknown threat was more dangerous than a familiar one. It meant someone had been watching him long before he had started watching them. That wasn't something he could ignore. He needed to move. Now he parked the stolen sedan in a lot near an abandoned warehouse, wiping down the steering wheel before stepping out. He wasn't sloppy. No prints, no evidence, no trails. By the time the man he had left on the street found the car again, it would be nothing but an empty shell. Darius walked into the night, his mind already shifting to his next move. He needed information, and there was only one place to get it. The underbelly of the city wasn't built on violence, it was built on whispers. And no one knew whispers better than Carter Vance. Carter ran an information network, a man who made a living by selling secrets to the highest bidder. He wasn't a friend, he wasn't an ally, he was a businessman, and in his world everything had a price. Darius had used him before. Now he needed him again. The Black Hall wasn't a place for regular people. It was hidden behind an unmarked door in the basement of a forgotten building, accessible only to those who knew where to look. No signs, no advertisements. Just a place for men with power and criminals with money to conduct their business in the shadows. Darius stepped inside, his presence barely causing a ripple. The dim lighting cast long shadows, and the low murmur of voices filled the space. Conversations of deals, trades, and threats. Carter was exactly where he expected him to be. Sitting in the far corner, drink in hand, legs crossed in an easy display of confidence. He had always looked out of place in a world like this, dressed sharp, clean-shaven, more like a corporate executive than a man who traded in secrets. Darius walked over, pulling out the chair across from him. Carter didn't even blink. "Well," Carter said, swirling his drink, "that's a face I didn't expect to see tonight." Darius leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. "I need a name," Carter smirked. "I sell names, my friend. You know that." Darius pulled a thick envelope from his jacket and set it on the table. "I'm not here to negotiate." Carter's smirk widened as he reached for the envelope, flipping it open just enough to see the stack of crisp bills inside. "Efficient, as always," he mused. "All right, what name?" Darius's fingers tapped against the table. "Bishop." Carter's smirk faded. For the first time since Darius had walked in, his posture changed. Just slightly. Just enough for someone like Darius to notice. That told him everything. Carter knew exactly who Bishop was, and that meant he was dangerous. Darius leaned in. "Talk," Carter exhaled, setting his drink down. "You don't want to go down this road." Darius's jaw tightened. "I'm already on it." Carter studied him for a moment, then let out a slow breath. "Bishop isn't a person, he's an entity, a ghost. He operates under layers of misdirection, proxy names, hired hands. No one meets him. No one sees him. But his reach, it's deep. Deeper than you want to dig." Darius's eyes narrowed. "What does he do?" Carter hesitated. "Bishop runs contracts." Darius's breath slowed. "Assassination," Carter nodded. "And more. Political jobs, cover-ups, blackmail. He's not a hitman, he's an influence. People in power pay him to make problems disappear." Darius felt the weight of the words settle over him. He had expected a threat. But this was something else. Carter leaned forward slightly. "If Bishop is watching you, it's not random. Someone paid for his attention. And whoever did, they don't want you scared, Darius." He exhaled. "They want you dead." The words didn't shake him, but they did confirm one thing. This wasn't about Calloway and Mitchell anymore. Someone much bigger was pulling the strings. Darius sat back slightly, his mind already working through the possibilities. Bishop didn't target small players. He was paid to eliminate problems, which meant someone, somewhere, saw Darius as a problem. His eyes flicked back to Carter. "Who?" Carter let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Now that is the million-dollar question, isn't it?" Darius's fingers curled slightly, his patience running thin. "Then find me an answer." Carter sighed, rubbing his temple. "This isn't like your usual fights, man. You're not just taking down some dirty cops. You're stepping into something bigger. People with real power. The kind of people who don't make mistakes." Darius's gaze remained steady. Everyone makes mistakes. Carter studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. I'll see what I can dig up. Darius stood, sliding the envelope across the table. Don't take too long, Carter chuckled. Oh, trust me, I won't. Darius walked out of the black hall and into the cold night air, his mind sharper than ever. He had thought he was hunting. Now he realized he was being tested. Someone had put his name on a list. Someone had paid for him to be removed. But they had made a mistake. They should have killed him before he saw them coming. Because now, he wasn't just going to survive. He was going to win. The air outside was thick with tension, but Darius welcomed it. The city lights flickered against the wet pavement, the distant hum of traffic blending into the silence in his mind. He had a name. He had a direction. Now he needed confirmation. Bishop wasn't just another enemy. He wasn't some street-level operator or a corrupt officer with too much confidence. He was something else entirely, a force, a hidden hand shaping the world from the shadows. That meant whoever had paid him wasn't just looking for a simple act of revenge. They wanted Darius erased, and that made things personal. He moved through the streets with purpose, his body relaxed but his mind razor-sharp. The city felt different now. Every passing car, every face in the crowd, it all held weight, all carried the potential to be another piece in this game he hadn't even realized he was playing. And if Bishop was involved, that meant he wasn't the only piece on the board. He needed leverage. He drove across the city, his route precise, avoiding main roads, checking his mirrors for tails. The stolen car was gone, ditched in a long-term parking lot under a fake registration. Now he was back in something untraceable, something he had set aside for nights like this. A black sedan, no GPS, no registration under his name. Just a ghost vehicle for a ghost operation. He made his way to a storage facility on the south side, one of many locations he had established over the years. It wasn't just paranoia, it was preparation. He had always known there would be a day when he had to disappear. He just hadn't expected it to come so soon. He pulled into an empty slot, killed the engine, and stepped out. The lot was quiet, the hum of fluorescent lights above casting eerie shadows along the metal doors. His unit was near the back, Unit D-17, one of several he had scattered across the city. He unlocked it smoothly, rolling up the metal door in one swift motion. Inside, the space was neat, organized. Weapons, cash, spare phones, fake IDs, everything he needed to move without leaving a trace. But tonight, he wasn't running. He was hunting. He grabbed a tactical bag, loading it with essentials: 2 suppressed pistols, extra magazines, a combat knife, and a burner phone. He slipped on a dark jacket, checking his reflection in the small mirror against the wall. He didn't look like a soldier, didn't look like a man trained to kill. And that was the point. He zipped the bag, then reached for his laptop, powering it up with one goal in mind: find the money. Whoever hired Bishop had to pay him, and that meant there was a digital trail. Bishop was a ghost, but no ghost operated without funding. Contracts that big, hits on former military, weren't cheap. Someone had wired a large sum of money, and Darius just needed to find out where it had landed. He plugged in a secure connection, running through backdoor channels only a few people in the world even knew existed. Minutes passed. Then something flashed on the screen. A bank transaction. $1.5 million. Darius's eyes narrowed. The money had moved through 3 shell companies before landing in an offshore account. But the origin? That was the part that made his blood run cold. The payment had been authorized by a government contract. Darius leaned back slightly, his fingers tightening into fists. This wasn't a grudge. This wasn't just about Calloway and Mitchell. This was federal. He had been marked as a problem by someone in power. The realization settled over him like a slow-burning fire. He had thought he was fighting a personal war, that his enemies were just 2 corrupt cops who had gone too far. But this was something much deeper. Someone in the system had decided that Darius wasn't just a man to be silenced. He was a threat, a loose end that needed to be cut before it unraveled something bigger. But what? His past had been buried. His military record was classified, sealed under layers of national security clearances. He had made enemies overseas, sure, But those enemies weren't the kind to move through government channels. No, this was someone closer. Someone who knew exactly what he was capable of, and someone who knew that if he lived, they had a problem. He needed a name. Carter would take time to track Bishop's movements, and Darius didn't have time. He needed answers now, and there was only one person who might have them: Calloway. The officer wasn't smart enough to be the mastermind, but he was dirty enough to be a pawn. And if Darius knew one thing about corrupt men, it was this: they always broke under pressure. By midnight, he was waiting. Calloway's house was a modest two-story in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where people never expected violence to arrive at their door. Darius had been watching for an hour. The house was dark except for a single upstairs light, the bedroom. Calloway was alone. No wife, no kids, no backup. Perfect. Darius moved in. He approached the back door, lockpicks working quickly against the deadbolt. A second later, the door clicked open, and he stepped inside, moving through the shadows with ease. The house smelled of whiskey and sweat, the faint hum of a television playing from the other room. Calloway had been drinking. Hard. Darius moved silently up the stairs, stopping just outside the bedroom. The door was slightly open, giving him a clear view inside. Calloway sat on the edge of his bed, shirt unbuttoned, a glass of liquor in one hand, his other gripping his phone. His face was pale, his eyes wide, scanning the screen like he was looking for salvation. Darius stepped inside. Calloway barely had time to register the movement before Darius grabbed him, yanking him down onto the floor in one smooth motion. The glass shattered against the carpet. A second later, Darius had him pinned, a hand clamped over his mouth, a blade pressed just below his throat. "Shh," Darius murmured. "We're going to have a conversation." Calloway's body trembled beneath him, his breath coming in panic bursts. His eyes darted to the gun on the nightstand just inches away. Darius smirked. "Go ahead, try it." Calloway didn't move. Darius leaned in slightly, his grip tightening. "Who put my name on that contract?" Calloway shook his head quickly, muffled words dying against Darius's palm. Darius removed his hand just enough for him to speak. "I don't know," Calloway gasped, his voice shaky. "I swear, I don't—" Darius pressed the blade in slightly. "Wrong answer," Calloway whimpered, his entire body tense. "It wasn't me. It wasn't Mitchell. We don't have that kind of pull. We're small time compared to that." Darius's eyes darkened. "Then who does?" Calloway swallowed hard, his breath ragged. "The feds," he whispered. "Someone high up. They—" He hesitated. Darius pressed harder. "They called us before the shooting," Calloway admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Told us to watch you. Told us you weren't just some civilian." Darius's pulse slowed. "They knew who you were," Calloway muttered, his eyes filled with something close to fear. "And they wanted you gone." Darius exhaled, his mind already shifting, piecing the puzzle together. Someone in the government knew him, knew his past, knew what he could do, and they wanted him erased before he figured out why. Darius pulled back slightly, his expression unreadable. Then he smirked. "Well," he murmured, "now they have a problem." Darius sat in the driver's seat of his car, parked 2 blocks from Calloway's house. His fingers tapped against the steering wheel, his mind racing. The night was quiet, but his world had never been louder. Someone in the federal system had marked him, someone with power, and Calloway, drunk, panicked, desperate, had just confirmed it. Darius replayed the officer's trembling words in his head. "They called us before the shooting, told us to watch you, told us you weren't just some civilian." That meant this had started long before Titan's death, long before the confrontation on that quiet street. Darius had been in their sights for weeks, maybe months, and he had never seen it coming. His pulse remained steady, his mind locked onto a single goal. He needed to force them out of the shadows. If they wanted him dead, he'd give them a reason to come looking. The next morning, the city woke up to chaos. It started with a leak. Darius had already prepared the files: Calloway's involvement, Mitchell's history, every corrupt incident they had covered up over the years. But this wasn't just about 2 dirty cops anymore. This was about the people who had protected them. He sent the files to the right people: investigative journalists, independent news sources, legal watchdogs. Not mainstream media. They were too slow, too compromised. He needed people who weren't afraid to burn bridges. By noon, the headlines hit. Exposing blue wall corruption, inside a police cover-up, falsified reports, missing body cam footage, and a dead dog. Who's hiding the truth? Officer Calloway and Mitchell under internal review. Connections to federal agencies uncovered. The city had been simmering with tension for months, waiting for something to ignite it. And now, with real evidence, real names, it was on fire. Protesters gathered outside the precinct. Reporters swarmed the building, demanding answers. And in the middle of it all, Calloway and Mitchell were trapped. Darius watched from a rooftop across the street, unseen. Mitchell stepped out of the station first, shoving through reporters, his face pale, his eyes darting left and right. He knew. He knew the moment the headlines dropped that he was done. Calloway followed, his steps less frantic, but his jaw clenched, his body stiff. He wasn't afraid yet, but he would be, because this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Darius pulled out his phone and sent a message to Carter. "I need Bishop's location, now." Carter replied within minutes. "That's not how this works." Darius smirked. "It is now." The sun had barely set when Carter called. Darius answered on the first ring. "You're playing a dangerous game," Carter's voice came through, laced with frustration. Darius leaned against the hood of his car, parked in an empty lot outside the city. "You got something for me?" Carter sighed. "You're not going to like it." Darius stayed silent. "Bishop isn't local," Carter continued. "He moves city to city, contract to contract. No home base, no traceable patterns. But," he hesitated. Darius's fingers twitched. But I found something," Carter exhaled. 2 weeks ago, a private jet landed at a military airstrip outside the city. Unregistered flight plan. No official records. The tail number? It's linked to a government contract. And guess what? Darius's grip tightened around the phone. The name on the clearance request was Bishop. The air between them was thick with unspoken weight. Darius pushed off the car, pacing slightly. "He's here." "Or was," Carter corrected. "But if Bishop is working this job, he's not just subcontracting. This is personal, and that means he's not going to hide forever." Darius nodded to himself. "I don't need him to hide. I just need him to come to me." Carter let out a dry laugh. "And how exactly do you plan on doing that? You're already a moving target." Darius smirked. "That's the point." Carter groaned. "Darius, I need you to do one more thing," Darius interrupted. Carter sighed. "Why do I feel like I'm about to regret this?" Darius ignored him. "Find out who hired Bishop." There was a pause, then Carter's voice dropped. "You sure you want that answer?" Darius's jaw tightened. "I'm counting on it." Carter didn't argue. He just exhaled. "Give me a few hours." The line went dead. Darius put the phone down and looked out at the city skyline. If Bishop had flown in, that meant the hit was fresh. Someone had pulled the trigger on this operation recently, which meant he still had time to flip the script. That night, he made himself known. He walked into O'Malley's again. Bold, direct, the same place he had confronted Calloway. But this time, he wasn't looking for cops. He was looking for people who knew things. Eyes turned as he entered. Conversation slowed. Word had traveled. A man like him didn't just show up twice unless he wanted something. He sat at the bar, ordered a whiskey, and waited. 15 minutes later, someone slid into the seat beside him. Slim build, sharp eyes, a face that had seen things. "You don't belong here," the man muttered. Darius smirked, sipping his drink. "Neither do you." The man didn't react, just studied him for a moment before saying, "I heard you're looking for Bishop." Darius didn't answer. The man exhaled, tapping his fingers against the bar. "You don't find him. He finds you." Darius turned slightly, meeting his gaze. "Then I'll make sure I'm easy to find." The man smirked. "That a death wish?" Darius leaned in, his voice calm. "No." He took another sip. "It's a warning." The man's smirk faltered, just slightly. That was enough. Darius stood, tossing cash onto the bar. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. And now, Bishop knew it. The hunt was officially on. Darius knew he had set a timer on his own life the moment he made himself visible. But that was the plan. Bishop wasn't a man who needed to be chased. He needed to be baited. And Darius had just made himself the most tempting target in the city. By the time he left O'Malley's, he could already feel the shift in the air. People were watching. The city had eyes, and now all of them were on him. Good. The streets were quieter as he drove. The hum of the engine, the only sound filling the silence. His thoughts were sharp, slicing through the details Carter had given him. Bishop had arrived under government clearance. That meant classified channels, secured funding. And that meant someone high up wanted this done. His phone buzzed. Carter. Darius answered without hesitation. Talk. You're not going to like this, Carter muttered. I found the contract authorization. Darius tightened his grip on the wheel. Who signed off? Carter hesitated. Then he said a name Darius hadn't heard in years. General Nathaniel Greer. Darius's stomach coiled. Greer wasn't just another name in a file. He was a man Darius had worked under years ago, a high-ranking officer in military intelligence, a strategist with a mind sharp enough to carve up entire nations, and a man who knew exactly what Darius was capable of. Carter's voice was tight. He's in D.C. right now, still on active duty, still making moves. And for whatever reason, he's the one who pulled the trigger on your contract. Darius exhaled slowly. That changed everything. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't a cover-up for some dirty cops. This was a preemptive strike. Someone like Greer didn't take out men like Darius over a local incident. This was bigger, way bigger, and Darius needed to know why. His voice was calm. How do I get to him? Carter let out a strained laugh. You don't, not directly. The man's protected, buried under clearance levels and Pentagon walls. If you go after him, you're not just fighting a ghost. You're fighting the entire U.S. government. Darius smirked. Then I won't go after him. Carter paused. You want Bishop instead. Darius's eyes darkened. I want them both. Silence. Then Carter exhaled. You're insane. Darius hung up. It didn't matter if Carter thought it was crazy. Bishop was already coming for him. And once Bishop was gone, Darius was going to war. The hit came faster than he expected. Darius had been waiting, watching his back, tracking shadows, anticipating the moment Bishop would make his move. But Bishop wasn't like other killers. He didn't strike in alleyways or dark parking lots. He didn't take chances with drawn-out fights. Bishop's first move was precision. Darius was halfway home when he noticed the shift. The car that had been 2 vehicles behind him for the last 3 miles. The sudden change in the flow of traffic, boxing him in. A setup. Darius's jaw tightened. Then, gunfire. Glass shattered as bullets tore through the back of his car. Darius swerved, gripping the wheel as his rear window exploded. Automatic fire. High-caliber rounds. This wasn't a warning. It was an execution. He slammed the gas, yanking the car hard to the right, tires screeching as he barely missed oncoming traffic. In the rearview mirror, he saw the chase. 2 SUVs, tinted windows, armed men inside. Not cops, not mercenaries. Bishop's men. Darius reached for his gun, ducking low as another round of bullets ripped through the side of his vehicle. He needed to move. Now up ahead, an intersection. On instinct, he yanked the wheel, forcing the car into a hard turn. Too hard. The tires screamed, the vehicle tilting dangerously before slamming onto the sidewalk, skidding into a row of parked cars. The world blurred, metal crunched, airbags deployed. Then, silence. For half a second, Darius lay still, his mind recalibrating. Then through the cracked windshield, he saw them. 4 men, stepping out of the SUVs, moving fast, weapons drawn. No sirens, no bystanders brave enough to intervene. This was a clean kill. Darius exhaled, and then he moved. He kicked the driver's door open, rolling out just as bullets tore through the air where his head had been. His gun was already up. 2 shots, center mass. The first man crumpled instantly. The second rushed forward. Darius twisted, slamming the gun across his jaw before yanking him into the line of fire. 3 more bullets hit his back instead of Darius's chest. 2 left. One of them flanked from the side, but Darius was already moving, closing the gap before the man could aim. He grabbed the wrist holding the gun, snapping it at an angle before burying a knife into his throat. The last man hesitated. Big mistake. Darius was on him in seconds, shoving him against the SUV, pressing the knife to his neck. The man's breath hitched, his eyes wide. Darius's voice was quiet. "Where's Bishop?" The man swallowed hard, his hands trembling. He's waiting for you." Darius's jaw clenched. "Where?" The man hesitated. Darius didn't. The knife pressed deeper. "Warehouse, Pier 39, the man choked out. "He knew you'd survive." Darius stared at him for half a second. Then, without another word, he knocked him unconscious with a brutal strike. He exhaled slowly, straightening, blood on his hands, bodies on the ground, and an invitation waiting. The final confrontation. The warehouse loomed ahead, Pier 39, isolated, no security cameras. The perfect place for a ghost to operate. Darius stepped inside, his gun ready, his heartbeat steady, and there he was. Bishop, tall, refined, dressed in a suit, calm, unreadable, like a businessman, like an executioner. "You made a lot of noise," Bishop said smoothly. "You could have let this go." Darius smirked. "That's not who I am." Bishop sighed. "Shame. Greer thought highly of you once." Darius's expression hardened. "Tell Greer I'm coming." Bishop chuckled. "You won't live that long." Then he moved. The fight was brutal. No wasted movements, no hesitation. Bishop was fast, precise. But Darius was faster. He had nothing to lose. The struggle lasted seconds. Then, a knife to Bishop's heart. The assassin gasped, blood spilling down his shirt, eyes widening in shock. Darius leaned in, his voice a whisper. "This was never your fight." Bishop shuddered, then fell. The war wasn't over. Bishop was dead. But Greer was still out there. Darius walked out of the warehouse, the ocean wind whipping against his skin. He wasn't done. This was just the beginning. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.